April 1945, the outskirts of Weimar, Germany. The war was ending, but not the fear. Along a dirt road scarred by tank tracks, a group of German women marched silently, their uniforms mismatched, faces streaked with soot and fatigue. Some were nurses, others radio operators or clerks from shattered Luftwaffe units. Behind them, the Reich was collapsing. Ahead, the distant rumble of American trucks drew closer. They had been told stories that capture meant humiliation, that defeat would strip them of their dignity. So they averted their eyes when the olive-drab convoy stopped. Boots hit the ground. Orders were shouted in English. The women froze, bracing for cruelty. But instead of rifles, the soldiers carried metal buckets of water. One by one, they handed out bars of soap, towels, coffee. The prisoners stared in disbelief, realizing for the first time that the enemy they feared had come not to break them, but to remind them of their humanity. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was disintegrating from within. Cities lay in ruins, roads were choked with refugees, civilians, wounded soldiers, and uniformed women from collapsed support units. Allied bombers ruled the skies. Fuel, food, and hope were nearly gone. Every order from Berlin sounded more desperate than the last. Among those swept up in the chaos were thousands of women who had joined the war effort in service roles. Not on the front lines, but close enough to hear it coming. The Luftwaffen-Helferinnen operated communication lines, guided anti-aircraft batteries, and kept records for divisions that no longer existed. Others were Red Cross nurses, clerks, or members of the Wehrmacht's Female Auxiliary Corps. Many were barely out of school when the war found them. As American and British forces pushed deep into Western Germany, whole units of these women were abandoned. Commanders fled or were captured. The once proud uniforms became symbols of guilt and defeat. Rumors ran wild that Soviet troops to the east spared no one, that women would be punished for serving Hitler's Reich, and that surrender meant shame. Every mile west was a gamble, toward a rumored, kinder enemy, toward men who, despite the war, might still remember the rules of civilization. For these women, surrender was not only a military act, but an act of faith. Yet even as the American lines approached, fear ruled their every step. Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies, especially Americans, as monsters. Women were told that capture meant abuse, or worse. Many carried cyanide capsules. Others swore never to be taken alive. When the moment finally came, when trucks bearing white stars rolled into their shattered towns, they expected the worst. What they encountered instead would challenge everything they had been taught to believe. On the Western Front, the American approach to prisoners of war stood in stark contrast to what was unfolding in the East. While the Red Army's vengeance burned across Prussia, driven by the horrors of Nazi occupation, the U.S. Army operated under the strict framework of the Geneva Convention of 1929. It required humane treatment, medical care, and basic dignity for all captives, even those who had once served the enemy's cause. By early 1945, American field commanders were overwhelmed by the sheer number of surrendering Germans. Entire divisions laid down their arms without a fight. Among them were thousands of women, not combatants, but uniformed auxiliaries who had lived under years of indoctrination. For many, it was their first direct contact with an Allied soldier. To the Americans, these prisoners were not threats. They were remnants of a dying regime. A military police report from the 4th Armored Division noted that female prisoners showed extreme nervousness upon capture, but discipline was easily maintained through courtesy and routine. The Army's own code of conduct emphasized restraint, a moral discipline forged in the belief that civilization was measured not by victory, but by mercy. Still, the women did not know this. They expected the war's end to mirror its brutality. When trucks arrived, they huddled together, eyes down, trembling. Some tried to hide their insignia, others whispered prayers. Years of propaganda about the enemy beasts had hardened into instinctive terror. Then came the moment of dissonance, when reality fractured the myth. American soldiers, weary from months of fighting, offered them food. They were given clean water to wash. The simple gesture of handing a bar of soap became something profound, a small act of humanity that echoed louder than any speech. For the captured women, it wasn't just kindness. It was a revelation that the world beyond the Reich was not the nightmare they had been promised, the human angle they had not eaten properly in days. When the order to surrender came, many of the women carried nothing but canteens and torn photographs from home. Their boots were split open, their hair matted with dust. As the American convoy stopped, some tried to stand at attention, desperate to preserve a shred of dignity. Others simply wept, silent tears that had waited years to fall. To the soldiers who faced them, these were not the defiant faces of the Nazi enemy. They were young, frightened, and hollowed out by war. Some of the GIs, men from Iowa, Texas, or New Jersey, thought of their own sisters back home. When they offered soap and towels, it wasn't charity. It was instinct, a human impulse to cleanse, to restore order in a world collapsing into chaos. That moment, the washing of dirt and fear from trembling hands, became a quiet bridge between two sides of a shattered continent. It was not forgiveness, but recognition that suffering had been shared by all. The moral angle, the war had forced ordinary people into moral extremes. For 6 years, mercy had been redefined as weakness and cruelty as strength. Yet on that day, in a ruined German village, the power dynamic shifted. The conqueror extended compassion to the conquered. This was not an act of political theater. No cameras, no officers recording the gesture. It was war stripped bare, revealing the fragile thread of decency that still survived beneath the rubble. For the American soldiers, many of whom had liberated concentration camps only days before, the encounter carried a deeper weight. They had seen the depths of human depravity. Offering soap to the enemy's women was more than cleanliness. It was reclamation, a statement that civilization, even scarred and weary, still had rules. And for the women, shivering, defeated, but alive, the meaning was even greater. It was the first time in years they were treated not as instruments of ideology, but as human beings. In that fragile silence between captor and captive, something timeless emerged. Dignity, rediscovered through compassion. The cultural and ideological angle for years, Nazi Germany had cultivated an image of invincibility and purity. Its women, especially those in uniform, were portrayed as loyal extensions of the state, guardians of the home front, and symbols of Aryan pride. Propaganda posters had shown them smiling beside anti-aircraft guns, framed by slogans promising victory and honor. But now, in the spring of 1945, those same women stood before the enemy they had been taught to despise. Everything they believed about the outside world began to unravel. The soap in their hands became more than a token. It was proof that the barbaric Americans were not the savages their leaders had described. The realization struck hard. Many had joined auxiliary service not from fanaticism, but from necessity, or the quiet coercion of duty. Now, stripped of ideology and command, they saw the moral ruin their nation had become. The men who had promised them greatness were gone, and in their place stood soldiers who offered mercy instead of revenge. That single act of kindness challenged years of indoctrination more effectively than any battlefield victory could. It revealed a truth about power, that real strength lies not in domination, but in restraint. The military and disciplinary angle behind this moment of humanity was an entire system built on discipline. The U.S. Army, hardened by years of combat from North Africa to Normandy, carried strict orders on the treatment of prisoners. Officers knew that every act of cruelty risked moral corrosion within their own ranks. Maintaining order and decency wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. Military police manuals emphasized that the treatment of the defeated reflects the character of the victor. Commanders enforced it rigorously. Soldiers caught mistreating captives faced court-martial. Even amid exhaustion and grief, structure held firm. And so, when the columns of German women appeared, frightened, exhausted, unarmed, procedure-guided compassion. They were searched, logged, and given basic supplies. But what lingered wasn't the bureaucracy. It was the tone, respectful, controlled, human. The Americans understood that wars end not only with surrender, but with the restoration of order. To hand an enemy a towel was to say, "The killing is over. Civilization endures." The surrender came without ceremony. No white flags, no formal negotiations, only exhaustion. It was late afternoon when the column of women reached a crossroads near Weimar. The sky was low and gray, filled with drifting smoke from a nearby village. American jeeps were parked along the roadside, their machine guns unmanned but ready. The war, for all its chaos, had paused in this small pocket of stillness. A young U.S. lieutenant stepped forward. His uniform was dusty, his face drawn from days without sleep. The women froze. Some clutched their helmets, others instinctively raised their hands. Their commander, a woman in her 30s, a Luftwaffe clerk with trembling lips, stepped out of line and offered a salute that faltered halfway. The lieutenant nodded, signaling his men to lower their weapons. A silence fell over the group, heavy enough to make every breath audible. Orders were exchanged quietly. An interpreter stepped forward, his German clumsy but kind. "Keine Angst. You are safe now." The words barely registered. Safety was a concept they had forgotten. One by one, the Americans began to search them. Efficient, procedural, but not rough. Weapons were taken. Identification tags collected. And then, something unexpected. Water buckets appeared. Towels. Metal cups of coffee passed down the line. At first, the women hesitated, thinking it was a trick. But the Americans waited patiently. One soldier, barely 20, smiled awkwardly as he handed a bar of soap to a woman who couldn't meet his eyes. She took it with shaking hands, staring at it as if it were an alien object. The lieutenant said nothing. He simply nodded once more, as if to affirm a silent understanding between enemies. Around them, the war continued. Artillery in the distance, planes overhead. But for that brief moment, at that lonely crossroads, something shifted. The rituals of war gave way to something profoundly human. The women began to wash their hands. The soldiers turned away, giving them privacy. And as the mud and soot ran off into the puddles, so too did the last remnants of propaganda, dissolving into the cold spring rain. As dusk settled, the scene softened into something almost sacred. The women sat in silence near the roadside, their uniforms damp and clinging to their skin. The scent of soap, faint, clean, unfamiliar, drifted through the air. For the first time in years, they felt the simple sensation of cleanliness, of warmth. Some began to speak softly, exchanging names, memories, fragments of lives buried beneath 6 years of war. Across from them, American soldiers lit small fires for warmth. They spoke in low voices, avoiding eye contact out of respect. A medic made rounds, tending to blistered feet and raw hands. One woman, a nurse from Hamburg, was given a bandage for her arm. When she whispered, "Danke," the soldier only nodded, not realizing that word would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. The war, in that moment, lost its power to dehumanize. The American lieutenant wrote a brief report that evening. Female prisoners cooperative. Supplied water, soap, and rations. No incidents. A line of text. Unemotional, bureaucratic. Yet behind it lay something far larger than any military entry could capture. For the captured women, the emotional weight was overwhelming. Some cried openly. Others, too proud to weep, stared blankly into the fire, trying to reconcile years of fear with this unexpected gentleness. A few even confessed, in later diaries, that this moment broke something inside them, not their pride, but their certainty. The image of the merciless enemy had vanished forever. When morning came, the prisoners were transported to a temporary holding camp outside Eisenach. Trucks rolled through the mist, engines humming softly. The women were quiet, heads bowed, but the fear was gone. One recalled later, "They treated us as if we were people again." I had forgotten what that felt like. For the Americans, the day passed like any other. A checkpoint, a transfer, another duty completed. But in that small act of civility, they had restored something the war had nearly destroyed: faith that even amid ruin, humanity could still choose compassion. In the weeks that followed, the women were processed through the U.S. Army's temporary prisoner of war camps scattered across central Germany. Most were held near Eisenach, Weimar, and Kassel, makeshift enclosures of barbed wire and canvas, built to contain the hundreds of thousands surrendering each day, compared to the brutality that many German POWs faced on the Eastern Front. Life under American custody was austere but humane. Records from the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's office detail standardized treatment. Every prisoner, regardless of rank or gender, was to be given shelter, food, and medical care according to Geneva regulations. The women slept in communal tents, sharing thin blankets against the chill of April nights. Rations were modest but consistent: bread, canned meat, coffee substitute. Each morning began with roll call, followed by light labor or clerical work. For most, the hardest adjustment wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the silence. No orders barked, no propaganda music, just the quiet hum of survival. In these camps, many began to speak with their guards, halting conversations in broken English and German. They asked questions about America, about freedom, about whether people there truly lived without fear. The soldiers, often no older than the prisoners themselves, answered with awkward kindness. For the first time, the women encountered a world not defined by ideology, but by decency. They saw that discipline did not require cruelty, and that power could coexist with respect. In diaries later found in post-war archives, several wrote of that moment at the crossroads: the soap, the towels, the coffee, describing it not as luxury, but as rebirth. One wrote simply, "They made me feel human again." By summer 1945, most of the female prisoners had been transferred from temporary holding areas to more organized camps run jointly by U.S. and British authorities. Their detention was short-lived compared to male POWs. Within months, many were released to help with the massive effort of rebuilding their ruined homeland. Some found work in field hospitals under Allied supervision, translating, nursing, or helping displaced civilians. Others returned to their hometowns, or what was left of them, to find families scattered and homes turned to dust. The memory of capture, however, lingered quietly among them. It became a private point of reflection, often spoken of only decades later. Post-war testimonies collected in the 1950s reveal how profoundly that brief encounter had affected them. One former Luftwaffe assistant recalled, "We had been told that the Americans would destroy us. Instead, they gave us soap and let us wash our faces. I cried, because I did not understand such kindness." Another woman, captured near Gotha, remembered the scent of that soap, the smell of a world that still believed in cleanliness, in order, in mercy. For many, those first small gestures symbolized the true end of the war. Not the signing of surrender documents or the raising of flags, but the quiet restoration of humanity between people who had been enemies the day before. Historians later noted that such interactions, though small in scale, carried immense psychological impact. They helped dismantle years of indoctrination and ease the transition toward a post-war identity no longer bound by Nazi mythology. What had begun as a moment of disbelief on a muddy roadside had rippled outward, shaping how these women, and their children after them, would remember both defeat and deliverance. War destroys cities, armies, and ideologies, but its deepest wounds are often invisible. In April 1945, a group of frightened women discovered that mercy could survive even among ruins. What began as a gesture, soap, water, a towel, became a quiet act of resistance against everything war had taught both sides to forget. The Americans who handed over those small tokens likely never realized the power of what they did. They didn't rebuild nations or rewrite history that day. They simply reminded the defeated that decency still existed. And in doing so, they reclaimed a small piece of their own humanity. For the women, that moment remained a fragile light, amid years of darkness, proof that compassion could reach across barbed wire and shattered pride. History rarely records such details, yet they endure longer than the sound of gunfire, because in the end, the truest victory of war is not won on battlefields. It is found in the moments when enemies choose to be human again.